Whatever you want to achieve from a communications or storytelling or narrative building point of view, some of those doors are firmly shut. Some of those doors are firmly open, wide open. Some are cracked open. And so you have to prioritize, depending on what you're working on, which door do I want to spend time with?
Hi, everybody. This is Dan Gaynor. Welcome to another episode of Signal in the Noise. On this one, we have a fascinating discussion with Dan Morrison, somebody with an incredible background that is difficult to summarize because he's worked in so many places and done so many fascinating things. We dive into compelling topics, starting with the power of thought leadership for explaining and teaching and building authority in your field. He emphasizes the importance of having a consistent narrative, one that you consistently and continuously campaign on across all your priority audiences. He's also a professor at Johns Hopkins, and he's deeply passionate about teaching the next generation to become critical thinkers and embracing AI as a debating partner to question your assumptions and your biases and strengthen the arguments that you're making. Across his career, he's done everything from be the head of global communications at Pew Research Center, the head of global media at OECD in Paris. He was a speechwriter at the State Department, even a financial journalist nominated for a Pulitzer at Bloomberg. Welcome, Dan Morrison, to the show.
Dan, it's great to be with you.
I think we'll have to do Morrison and Gaynor on this one, but you've got a more, I think, Barry White style voice. Really excited to have you on here. Where are we finding you beaming in from today?
Washington, D.C. Actually, just outside Old Town Alexandria.
Very, very cool. A good trip from the Georgetown waterfront via water taxi for any of those who are looking to do a tourist trip to DC, my old haunt. Well, Dan, we're thrilled to have you on the call today. Obviously, I've had a chance to chat with you offline, so I'm glad to do it with you in a recorded setting. You've got one of the coolest, most interesting / Dr. Seuss-like swishing, swashing career arcs out there. Tell us, was it all part of a master plan? And if not, what were the key forks in the road?
Of course it was a master plan, Dan. How many people come on your podcast and tell you that it was a total master plan?
I haven't interviewed Vladimir Putin yet, but when I do, I'm assuming I'll get a yes.
No, look, I mean, some of it's intentional, some of it's dumb luck, right? As they say. No, there was no arc. Other than gravitating towards things that captivated me and continue to captivate me. Challenging myself. I think it's really important that we all do that. And often not taking no for an answer. It's really important to keep going. Those have been sort of themes through whatever I've tried to do in my career. And, I have students and others that I mentor along the way. And it's incredible to me. They think a career is sort of a vertical career like this, like a hockey stick. And I'm like, no, it's 2 steps forward. It's 1 step sideways. It's sometimes 1 step back. So no, there is no hockey stick to a career. Very few people have that.
Well, how about this? Let me be a bit more specific, which is I think that either nonprofits, government, or large international organizations like the OECD are amazing training grounds that you can learn a ton of skills that are very applicable to the private sector. And I would just love to double click on that part of your career in particular. Tell me a little bit about, I know it's not necessarily in like chronological order, but your time at State and OECD and anything else you had done between DC and Brussels.
Strangely, I started my career in Brussels. That's strange, I say, for an American. I was a child of the Cold War. I studied American literature as an undergrad, and I did a lot of comparison between this thing called the Soviet Union and ourselves. I wanted to kind of better understand the other, so to speak. And you would compare literature like, Moby Dick or Pushkin's, The Captain's Daughter, for example. And you think, wow, they're not so different from us, or they're widely different from us, right? And I never thought in a million years that I would be applying that skill set of understanding the other in my own country, given the polarization that we're feeling right now. But it's been a great skill set through my career. So I started my career in Brussels. I had a great opportunity, a weird fascination with what was going on with the EU at the time. There were only 12 countries then. I was very alone as an American in many ways in Brussels, but I kind of learned my civics in reverse. I learned I learned it there. And then I came to Washington later on in my career. And sometimes that's important. You don't have to take a linear path.
That's right. And I imagine you instantly gained some translation skills, or at least some geopolitical credibility that has helped you transcend continents as you've done throughout your career. Let's then pivot a bit to the private sector side of things. I mean, you've worked for really large organizations that are in themselves like multilateral institutions, Bloomberg, IBM, Pew. Tell me a little bit about the sort of roles you've had on the in-house side, so to speak.
So at a place like IBM, very interesting moment. I was headhunted out of Bloomberg News in New York, where I was a financial journalist to write speeches for their senior executive suite. You never think you're going to do what your father did, but my father was a speechwriter in his career. He was, if you remember Lee Iacocca, who was chairman of Chrysler, he was his speechwriter for a long time. And very funny to get a call out of the blue, like, hey, would you like to do what your dad does? That's not how it was expressed. And I thought, well, I'll give that a try. And in many ways, IBM was struggling at the time. And a guy named Lou Gerstner came in and had a vision for the company. And I learned a tremendous amount about thought leadership at a place like IBM. How do you get a large number of people to create a North Star and move in a single direction? Had a lot of good mentors that I was very lucky to have there. Shout out for Mark Harris and Mike Wing and John Iwata. Those are people that I learned from at a place like IBM. State Department was a very different place indeed. I had not spent time in Washington before. The whole impetus for me going to Washington was this thing called September 11th. My wife and I were living in Manhattan when it happened. We were walking to work. We lost a neighbor upstairs in our apartment building. We lost a neighbor below. Yeah, a lot of people have these stories. And I thought, I got to get involved in some way. And I started talking to the State Department, and ultimately, a door opened. And I had the opportunity to go there and do a combination of speech writing and then policy after that. That's one of those sort of moments where you hold your breath and jump in and say to yourself, yeah, that made sense. Now, to be fair, I thought I was the only idiot who left a good job at IBM to go do that. Until a few months later in Washington, I started meeting other idiots who had left finance or business or something else to come at that moment in time to serve.
It's funny because I did some time in government myself, but I definitely wouldn't be classified as an idiot because I wasn't making more money prior to doing that. I think it'd be much harder to go from the private sector back into government. And the fact that you did it, major kudos to you. You are rarer than you are articulating. I'd be so interested in just talking to you a little bit about what you're doing today. As I understand it, you've launched something new. As I understand, it's called StoryVenture. It's focused on being a co-pilot for thought leadership. Tell me a little bit about what StoryVenture is and how you're taking all these incredible lessons learned on a global scale in multiple organizations, within government and tech and everything in between, into StoryVenture and what it hopes to achieve for your customers and clients.
So I'm doing a few things. I'm advising. I'm teaching. I also teach strategic and political communications and persuasion at Johns Hopkins University here. And StoryVenture is really, as many things are in one's career, a culmination of what you've already done. I sort of scratched my head and thought, how do I take the lessons that I've learned along the way and apply them, right, to this? So some of the lessons, for example, I mentioned IBM, thought leadership, the ability to create a North Star, right? Lessons I learned at the State Department were persuasion and trust at a pretty difficult moment in American diplomacy. At Bloomberg was still kind of embryonic when I was at Bloomberg. So how do you maneuver as a startup, as a newbie in an established ecosystem at that time? I learned a lot about that. At the OECD in Paris, I learned about how do you nudge decision makers and policymakers with data, nudge them to do things that either they want to do but can't do, potentially politically, or didn't realize that they should do. That's the great thing about data, right? It's a big reveal. It's a mirror. Usually when you hold up that mirror, you look at it and on some days it says you look great, you look terrific. On another day it says you don't look so handsome today. That's the great thing about data. So I learned that at OECD. In a place like Pew Research, you learn that when you reveal uncomfortable truths to people, to society, you can make a difference. That was a place where I was reminded, because it was involved with polling, that citizens can have two conflicting ideas in their brain at the same time. If you poll them on the same questions this week as possibly next week, you might get different answers. So I took all of those lessons so far and I thought, what's a real thread through what I've been doing? And it's thought leadership. How do I define thought leadership, really? Thought leadership, people define it in different ways, but for me, it's doing three things. It's explaining, crystal clear explanation of what you're selling, what you're trying to achieve in the world, your vision, right? Number two, it's teaching. It's teaching people something. And sometimes something larger than yourself, larger than your organization itself. And then third is really building authority and building trust. And I came to the conclusion that in a really messy, noisy environment that we're in right now, thought leadership is one of the last, beachheads for building trust, because you can go directly to your stakeholders, directly to your audiences, bypass some of the traditional gatekeepers in many ways, right? There's fewer and fewer journalists out there and more companies trying to appeal to them, to write stories about them. And I just took the decision that, look, you better tell your story or somebody else will.
And it's like what I always say about a narrative. Either you set your narrative or the marketplace will do it for you. I'd be interested just to double click on thought leadership right now. Tell me just a little bit about the case for it and why it's so important. I feel like I talk to a lot of big companies out there who say, we put out press releases and we have a newsroom and we have quarterly earnings. And there are all these sort of like boring, very staid approaches. And then I'll read something of yours. One of the pieces of yours that I just love on your website is the lessons learned in leadership from being an official dog handler in the Iditarod cross-Alaskan Arctic dog sledding race. You talk about the importance of body language because, dogs can read your body language in confidence. You talked about speaking simply, like saying like hee-haw and going left and right with the dog sled was very important. Otherwise, you drive off a cliff. And it was so interesting how you took something very entertaining, like a dog sled race, and you gave me really valuable leadership lessons. Tell me just a little bit about that approach. Like when you're working with a big, hulking, boring company, not to call out IBM, but like using them as an example, what are ways that big, hulking, somewhat boring companies can be a little bit more inventive and more personable through the power of thought leadership? Why should they invest in that type of content?
Look, you won't be surprised to hear me say it all starts with storytelling. And storytelling really hasn't changed over the years. And in my class, I go way back with my students. I mean, I go all the way from Aristotle to Don Draper in Mad Men. And it really hasn't changed, storytelling. So I start there. It doesn't matter whether the company is large or small, quite frankly. And I'm always amazed. Yesterday, I was just doing some advising and mentoring for some startups. And I'm always amazed at the story that's right beneath people's nose. And even some of these folks that I work with, they'll say, look, I know I'm too close to it. It's like some of the best writers, they have to leave their own country in order to discover their country. And I always remember that, some of the best stories and works of fiction about a country come from either somebody who doesn't live there or somebody who's left there in order to have a little bit of a distance. So I try to work with that. I try to remind folks that you've got a story. Let's work on that. What is that story? What's unique about it? Because everybody's got something to teach. We as individuals have something to teach. Organizations have something to teach. And you just have to kind of tease that out.
It's so interesting. It very much relates to what you said about data. Putting the whole handsome comment aside, it's very interesting because data gives you distance. Data gives you an objective lens with which to view your industry, your competitors, and indeed yourself. So what we do a lot here is try to use AI to extract the truth versus our version of what our brand, our narrative, our perception should be. And so it's very interesting to hear your point about with storytelling, a key element is to step back, have a little bit of distance, And of course, as all storytellers know, put yourself in the audience's shoes. I'd be interested in how you operationalize that. And in particular, I wanted to ask you about like driving a comms transformation within a large organization. I mentioned a lot of them already, like IBM and Pew, and of course, even the State Department. There's no organization bigger than the government. Whether it's operationalizing that thought leadership approach or simply modernizing with data the operations of a comms function, are there any lessons you've learned about transforming comms into the function of the future?
There's a couple elements that are like constant. So what I've learned is that when you're trying to move a large group of people in one direction, I talked earlier about simplicity of message. Don't give them 7 things to think about. Don't give them 9 things to think about. Give them 3 things to think about, or maybe even just 1 thing to think about, right? And then guess what? You've got to repeat it. That's how you operationalize. That's the first step. You've got to repeat it. And you've got to be able to express to people, we're not done on week 1. We're not done in month 1. We're not done in year 1 necessarily, depending on the cadence of your campaign. And it's sort of operationalizing that is giving people those messages that they can make their own at times, as long as they come back to the parameters that you've set for them and the North Star that you've set for them. It's okay to let people levitate a little bit with their messages and then come back to it, as long as they're sticking to those messages, I think. That's the first thing I'd say, repetition and simplicity of message. And then what I've found wherever I have worked in large organizations, right? I vision a hallway, and that hallway has a series of doors. And whatever you want to achieve from a communications or storytelling or narrative building point of view, some of those doors are firmly shut. Some of those doors are firmly open, wide open. Come on in, Dan. I'd love to talk to you today. Some are cracked open. And so you have to prioritize, right? That's how you operationally. You've got to prioritize, depending on what you're working on, which door do I want to spend time with? Well, of course, the open doors are a given. Go in, come with me, follow my messages, come with me. The second is the cracked doors, of course. How do I get that door to be more firmly open? And sometimes you have to use psychology. When I was at IBM, for example, I remember I was working with their technology labs around the world. They had 7 technology labs. And somebody came to me and said, Dan, they're not talking to each other. They're brilliant folks, some of them with Nobel Prizes in their back pocket. They're not talking to each other. And we want to kind of understand that and figure out what we want to commercialize. And can you build an internal website that somehow gets these folks to talk to one another? And I said, sure. Can you do it in 3 months? And I said, no, I can't do it in 3 months, but I could probably do it in 9 months, And oh, by the way, Dan, you have no money to do this. Like, good luck. But I took that challenge.
Sounds like a tech company.
And what was fascinating to me is I would go and knock on those doors, and some people would say, why should I waste my time talking to you? Like, the comms person. And I said, well, are you sure? Because, I'd really like to get attention to what you're working on here. And Gerstner, by the way, at the time had sort of a firm view that if those technologies that people in the labs if they were unable to commercialize those in sort of 2-3 year time frame, they'd be cut off. So I'd go get somebody, work with them, get them attention. What do you think happened? The people who ignored me and said, no, we're not going to have lunch with you today, started knocking on my door, because you'd have an executive at IBM reading the Wall Street Journal over cereal one morning and say, I didn't realize we were doing this. I want to commercialize that. It was a lot of psychology, but I've remembered that, and I think I've tried to apply that wherever I work.
Such an interesting observation about the internal economy within a big company. And I've certainly seen this firsthand when I worked at Nike, but it's not necessarily like a perfectly meritocratic organization, and that you could drive the value proposition of emerging technologies. You were almost like the go-to-market guy, in a sense, using the levers of PR and communications for innovation storytelling. And then I just want to double click on something you said at the start of that answer, which is the importance of having a central foundation, a narrative with fewer, deeper storylines that you're campaigning on. And by the way, consistency of that campaign is essential. It's not like you put a message one time out there and there's a ChatGPT moment. In all likelihood, you have to keep hammering it home. I want to talk to you a little bit about the data side of things. I know that you, like most people, are experimenting with AI. I think in the arc of communications people out there, I think you're a bit more conversant and have experimented in a bit more creative ways with AI and all the different generative tools out there available to us. But I would just love to hear in general, and you can take this in either direction, how you've seen communications as a function transform from gut feel to data driven, and how we've seen communications be measured from landing a great piece to more sophisticated ROI style assessment. Tell me, what has the from to felt like for you with regard to how data, digital, and now AI have transformed the art and now science of communications?
Sure. So I'm tackling AI from sort of two perspectives. One from commercial perspective. How do we use it in our daily lives as communicators, right? Secondarily, I'm tackling it from the world of academia. So the course that I teach, for example, at Hopkins on public affairs and persuasion, I'm really trying to do experimentation with the students in class using AI, for example, and specifically for critical thinking to help them become critical thinkers. So one exercise, for example, that I do is that classic debate club exercise of, pick a topic that you feel passionately about, give the supporting evidence. But then I say, pause, now do the opposite of that, poke holes in your original argument. And by the way, you can use ChatGPT to do that. I'm going to let you use ChatGPT to poke holes in your original argument because we all have bias and we love our original arguments. And it's a little bit hard for us sometimes to actually find those holes, right? On a secondary level, I also say, is it hallucinating? Are you sure what it's spit out to you is accurate? I'm going to ask you to make sure that it is, right? So I'm actually very high on AI as a critical thinking tool. I think it's going to be helpful both in academia and also in the workplace and all of our lives in many ways if used properly. On the commercial side, look, AI is helping us do a couple things, right? Really, it's content and it's analysis. So in the comms world, I'm finding I'm making this number up, but I'm going to say you can kind of do 80% of what you need to do with AI on some level in the comms world. So what do I mean by that? I mean, you can use it to write a press release. You can use it to create a social media post, right? You can use it for stakeholder research, all that good stuff. It's the 20%, the human element, that I think is really critical here. I'd be remiss if I said, look, I'm a big believer in humans and AI walking into the future together. You've seen Eric Schmidt's book that he wrote with Henry Kissinger in the backdrop of sort of the nuclear arsenals, and I think one of the things that they were spot on with in the book that they wrote is you want a human at turning the key, not a machine, really at the end of the day. And I think that's true in communications as well. We're not going to turn everything over to AI, but it can do a lot and it will continue to do more. So I think it's going to help us with precision. It's going to help us on the analysis side be more predictive in the area of, let's take stakeholders, for example, allowing us to go deeper on who loves us and who hates us on a campaign. And you need to know that depending on where you're working. You don't want to fool yourself and, well, I've got some data about this group over here that hates us. Well, guess what? You might get stuck if you don't have precision on that in some way. So I think there's that, there's personalization, and there's just a fantastic opportunity for analytics to let us get closer to the audiences we're trying to reach.
Fabulous. Fabulous. I wanted to talk to you about, in fact, that final sentence as the next question, which is getting closer to the audiences that you're trying to reach. When it comes to communicating, how do you control your narrative amid a really noisy marketplace? And just to add a bit of context to this, we're recording this the first week of October. Israel's in a 3-front war. Russia, Ukraine continues to go on. Vladimir Putin just revised his red lines for using nuclear weapons. I'm sure that makes everyone sleep well at night. There's also, the continued up and down of labor and job numbers and rate cuts that hopefully will, not drive inflation back up. And then, of course, you think about all the concerns around AI, whether it's OpenAI pivoting from a nonprofit to a for-profit and all the executives fleeing, to thinking about Gavin Newsom vetoing some emerging AI legislation, yet we're seeing the rise of that in the EU. There's just so much going on right now. And I would be interested in your experience, whether it's historical or just lessons learned that you would apply to this current moment, in terms of how do you get close to the audience, get their attention, and stay consistent in a world that's whiplashing as fast as it is?
I think it starts with the proposition that you cannot control your narrative 100% of the time. So if you start there, you're a C-suite executive and you're head of communications in the office and you're frustrated by the fact that you can't control 100% of your narrative 100 all the time, right? That's a misleading proposition. I think it's probably never been true that you can have complete control over your narrative. But even now in this noisy environment that we're in, you have to start with that. You have to be honest about that. You might be able to control it 80% of the time, maybe 75% of the time, but never 100%. Second is being maniacally focused on on your vision and what you're trying to achieve, and being maniacally focused on who your audiences are and who they aren't. So, for example, some places need to make a decision between whether or not their audience is the general public or informed public. And that's not necessarily a haughty statement. It's an efficiency statement. Your data and great data from places like Signal AI, can help you decide, I thought my audience was this, but actually the data is helping me determine that it's actually not them. Here's another persona that's popping up in the data that I didn't see. I had a bit of a blind spot. What's valuable about that is then imagine from an organizational point of view how valuable that is from an efficiency standpoint. And I've lived that at places where I've been, where people walk into my office and say, I've got a great idea. Let's do a campaign for this audience. And you as a leader have to say to that person, is that consistent with our audience? It's great. I love what you've come into the office with, but is that actually our audience? And then you have that conversation. Oh, no, not really. Well, why is that important? Because you can say no. Having that structure allows you as a leader to say no to those moments where you could get bifurcated and run off the trail. Use the Iditarod example, run off the trail or fork off in a direction that you don't want to fork off into. I see the efficiency element of that.
Yeah, in other words, consistency breeds efficiency because you know what's going to be a yes and what's going to be a no based upon who your priority audiences are and if your messages are vectored towards them. I wanted to ask you about how all of these lessons learned come together in a story of success, right? You've talked a little bit about approach with regard to getting organizations on your side. You've talked about embracing data and digital. You've talked about consistency and having a central foundational narrative that you are continuously campaigning upon. And I would be interested just across your career, whether it's in New York or Washington or Brussels and Paris, whether it was at IBM or State or OECD or Pew, what are your favorite wins? What are some of your favorite activations, campaigns, or stories of success?
I would say at IBM, one moment, and this was a team, it wasn't just me. It reminds me a little bit of now of people being understandably concerned about where AI is going. But this was a moment where we built something called Deep Blue, which played Garry Kasparov at chess. You may remember that, right? Kind of a monumental moment. But
of course,
yeah, as you may imagine, there were a lot of stories out there that people were concerned about, man versus machine, 2000 Space Odyssey. Are machines going to take over? Is the computer going to take over? And along with colleagues, it was really important to sort of demystify that. So, computers can't get married. Computers don't have kids. They don't go watch their kid play soccer on the weekend type of thing. And really important lesson there for now, for how we talk about AI, I think, because some people hyperventilate about it. Some people are way too optimistic. I'd like to think I'm somewhere in the middle myself. I see the value, but I also see the challenges. At a place like the OECD, I was part of a management team there that created something called the Better Life Index. The premise of which was data, heavily data centric, was there's this figure called GDP, which is 75, 80 years old. Does it really capture what people value in their lives? And you may remember, totally geeky, wonky comment, but there was a speech by Bobby Kennedy, and late in his career, he gave a whole speech on GDP. And he actually ended the speech by saying, GDP can do a lot, but it can't accept the things that we value the most in our lives. And so as that as a backdrop, we tried to look at that and say, well, how can you measure lives? Not happiness, because there's others out there who are doing happiness indexes. How can we measure people's lives in a different way? Housing, life satisfaction, for example, education level. That was fantastic. That was a lot of fun, and we got that out there.
I think, by the way, I just Googled this while we were doing it. I remember this famous quote: the gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It doesn't include the beauty of our poetry or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. And the idea that you, at like the bastion of economic metrics, would try to move beyond this lagging and, while we're stuck with it, somewhat inaccurate metric, and frame it in the articulate prose of an incredible public servant. I think that's a great lesson for storytelling. Like, what's the best vehicle for a dry set of metrics? Use something that elegant.
As I say, that was a team. That was a team of us that worked on that. At Pew, one of the things that I found fascinating there was living through sort of just arrived after the 2016 presidential election and then 2020. And if you may remember, this is like a thought leadership moment is what I'm talking about here. You may remember that there's a lot of criticism about polling in general, right, after those two elections, without much distinction between the difference between, say, for example, national polls and local polls. And who's doing the poll, right? There's plenty of polls being done in ways that they shouldn't be done necessarily without the right methodology. And we looked at that, and Pew at the time had gotten out of the business of like horse race polling. And it was more sort of, we're going to focus on week to week, what are citizens thinking and feeling? And there was this gap sort of in the market of like, well, what makes for good polling and what makes for bad polling or less good polling? And we could have ducked that. We could have said, well, we're not doing horse race polling, so we don't really have any skin in this game. But we thought about that, and my team and I ended up working with our head of research methodology at the time to lean into it instead, because it was a leadership moment. Sort of that world was looking for somebody to come in and say, well, let's be clear about what makes for good polling and what makes for less good polling. So we leaned into that, and we wrote about it, and we put it on our blogs, and we put it on our website. And that was really rewarding because we didn't have to be there, but it was rewarding that we inserted ourselves, and we ended up getting kudos for that.
Fabulous. I think just two really fabulous examples of how like all your ninja skills have come to bear. I guess I want to end with one last thing, which is to tap your brain as a professor. You teach at Johns Hopkins, correct? And I would just be interested in, a lot of the folks that come on this podcast and listen to this podcast are senior executives like yourselves. But I think one of the things that the AI revolution has done in all of us is engendered this revamped focus on being a lifelong learner, having this growth mindset, continuously experimenting. And so in an interesting way, I'm finding a lot of executives in our space are really looking to, the recent college grads or the master's students to keep them current on what's important. And I would just be interested in, like, if we were to zip to the end of the semester, I know you just started the semester, but when we zip to the end of the semester, what are sort of like the last lecture words of wisdom that you give to your students, or the reflections that your students give to you as they're about to enter the workforce in the world of public affairs, marketing, and communications? Like, sort of, what are the things that you're seeing the youth really embrace as important to them? And similarly, like, what are the key things that if you were just starting your career out now, you would hold quite close to you to break open one of those cracked doors?
So you're right. It's sort of the beginning of the semester, so I haven't contemplated what I'm going to say at the end of the semester, but I'll give it a try. It will have something to do with starting with the premise that whether you like it or not, no matter how you feel about AI, this is going to be a co-pilot with you for the rest of your career and the rest of your life. So get busy learning about it. Get busy using it. Get busy becoming a terrific prompter. I say this to my son. I have a 17-year-old son, and it's strange because he's far more advanced than I am in certain technologies, including FIFA. He beats me every single time.
I only wish college age me could have played him. I was good in my time.
Oh, I've just degraded. But I'm teaching him about how to be a good prompter based on my communication skills. And I would like to think that I would say to my students, get really good at prompting, let this be your friend, but cast a critical eye through that process. Understand when it's hallucinating, when it's not. Use your critical judgment for this. But by all means, don't be on the sidelines of this thing, because I think it actually would be injurious to your career.
Fascinating. Well, this podcast was 100% human despite all the hubbub this week around Google Notebook LM. Maybe it could have done a better job than us, but not yet. Dan Morrison, you've forged a fantastic, very, very interesting career. Just one last question. This Danish soccer team that you've invested in, how are they doing?
So shout out, they're called Akademisk Bold Club, which means academic in Danish. A lot of people ask us, is this Ted Lasso? Is it Welcome to Wrexham? And I say, no, it's neither of those. I mean, first of all, we don't have Ryan Reynolds' platform. We don't have his money. Some of us don't have his hair. No, it's a completely different thing. What this is a venerable team that's been around since 1889. In fact, one of my favorite factoids about the team is that Niels Bohr, the Nobel Prize physicist, played goalie for us once upon a time. So did his brother Harold. Harold was a better player. Niels was off on doing other stuff. But I love that history, and the values of the club are academics, sustainability, right? And it's an adventure. It's an adventure. It's sort of individuals like myself who've come together to try to get this team back to the Superliga. They've fallen a couple leagues, and we're trying to get them back to the Superliga. And I guess what I'd say on that front is looping this back to data and humans, right? You got to do both. It's not a Moneyball situation where you're just using data only. And I loved your podcast, by the way, with Adam Grossman from the Red Sox recently. That was terrific. The chief marketing officer. It's a reminder to me that you've got to use data and human instinct. No amount of data is going to tell you ultimately what kind of grit a player has. No amount of data is going to tell you whether you're 2 down in the second half of a game and you just mentally fold. You have to use human intuition with that. So for me, having a great time with it. I know that my colleagues are as well. Go Owls. And we'll see what happens.
I love it. Well, Dan Morrison, thank you so much. Final question. If people want to reach out to you and hear a little bit about this new outfit you're building, how should they find you? Do you have a website, LinkedIn? What's the plug? Maybe
we could put that in the podcast notes, but again, it's called StoryVenture. You can find it on LinkedIn, StoryVenture LLC. You can find me on LinkedIn and see my webpage there. Those are probably the 2 best places to find us.
Great. Well, we'll definitely put the link in there. And thank you so much for sharing your incredible career arc, lessons learned, some of the hurdles you've gone through. For this episode of Signal in the Noise, I'm Dan Gaynor. Thank you, Dan Morrison. Tune in next time for another scintillating conversation. But until then, have a great weekend.